Well, 1 Thessalonians is an interesting one. It is, of course, the earliest writing of all the writings in the New Testament. So if you want something that's nearer to the time of Jesus than anything else, 1 Thessalonians is the first document that we have.
Okay, so First Thessalonians is a book written by Paul, the apostle, who is one of the the founders or the establishers of the Christian church. It's written to a church at Thessalonica, which is why it's called First Thessalonians. It's also called First Thessalonians because it's regarded as his first letter out of two that he sent to Thessalonica.
And Paul wrote it when he'd recently visited the Thessalonians and was pretty well compelled to leave the city because there was a riot. And so he writes back at once, well, not exactly at once, but pretty quickly, to say, I'm sorry I had to leave you. Please don't think it's because I don't care.
1 Thessalonians is a very positive letter. And so it contrasts with 1 Corinthians, for example. 1 Corinthians, you get the impression that there's a real tension between Paul and the church and he's constantly correcting them. Whereas 1 Thessalonians, you get the impression that he thinks they've really done a great job and he's just wanting to encourage them.
He then says, I need to instruct you a bit more carefully about the final coming of Christ.
People were worried by the fact that Christians were dying.
And they were pretty upset about that. Some of them thought that everyone would survive until the coming of Christ.
And so they were troubled by the fact that some in their church had died. Did that mean they were going to miss out on the return of Jesus?
There is an interesting section, probably the most well-known section in First Thessalonians is this section at the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5 that talks about, oh, you don't worry about those who have fallen asleep in Christ because we know when Christ comes back, they'll be raised and we'll be gathered together to him and we'll be with him like that always. This is where the idea comes from that the people who have died will be raised when Christ returns and they'll dwell with him like that forever. It also is a sort of a center of debate about this idea of the rapture, which is from the Latin idea, rapimur, or rapturo. My Latin's not so good, in case you didn't notice. Paul wrote his letters to Greek churches in Greek. The translation of the text into Latin is called the Vulgate, and the Latin translation renders a certain word into a form of rapturo, rapimur, meaning rapture or taken up, gathered up, snatched up. And so there's this image that Jesus is coming from heaven, and then people are somehow taken up to him. Now, in Greco-Roman tradition, this idea of rapture, of being taken up, comes from the idea of a king entering into a city after he's been victorious in battle. And so the people go out to meet him, but they usually bring him into the city after that. They don't disappear with him somewhere. Paul is trying to explain what exactly, how's it going to happen. And so he says, for the Lord himself, with a cry of command, with the archangel's call, with the sound of God's trumpet, will descend from heaven, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we, who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds together with them to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. So, yeah, that's the famous passage.
Nice timing.
The point here is that when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians and 1 Thessalonians, he gave us a kind of timetable of events like the Last Judgment and the coming of Christ and the resurrection. But when Paul wrote to the Philippians, he said, I'm torn between wanting to finish my ministry and die and become immediately in the presence of Christ. And it sounds as if Paul in Philippians and Paul in 1 Thessalonians is quite inconsistent, but he's not. If you think of an analogy, on Christmas Eve we say to excited children, the sooner you fall asleep, the sooner Christmas morning will come. So we hope that the next thing they know after falling asleep is, all being well, that it's Christmas morning. But meanwhile, we pack up presents, we prepare Christmas stockings, we get ready for Christmas lunch, and one is the standpoint of the onlooker or observer, and one is the standpoint of the person experiencing it. So, From the point of view of someone who dies, the next thing they know is that they will be with Christ. But from the point of view of people discussing a map of events, lots of things have first to happen. So there's no contradiction. They're both true.
The way that we have the book as it is now, Paul would write his letters to his churches. The churches would usually save that letter, and then they would tend to share the letter with other churches as well. There's a reference in other letters saying, well, now you've read this letter, also read the letter from here, and let them read your letter also. So, and then on top of that, the reason why we have extant copies of it is because churches and communities felt it worthwhile to have it copied. It was kind of expensive to have a scribe rewrite what you wrote, especially because you had to have somebody who's literate. They would charge you, they would write it, and then you would keep it. And so they would just collect these letters. Churches preserved them, and over time you'd have people copying them again and again. And yeah, that's basically how it gets to us. Then at the time, Greek was the main language, but the Roman Empire spoke Latin. So when Latin churches, Latin-speaking communities want to read the text, they end up translating it into Latin so that they have it for themselves as well.